After the Israelites had left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, they were free at last. The terror of slavery was behind them, and yet freedom came with uncertainty. God knew that his people needed guidance, so he began to instruct them on how to live in justice and righteousness. The people were no longer under Pharaoh, but they were now under God, and his rules were meant to shape them into a holy nation, a people who reflected his character in every aspect of life. God began with laws concerning servants and workers. A servant who came freely into service was to serve for 6 years and then be released in the 7th. If a servant had a family, their rights were protected, and they were to be treated fairly. God valued freedom and choice, making clear that oppression had no place among his people. Every human being had worth, and every life mattered. God then addressed personal injury. If someone caused harm to another, there were consequences. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was not about revenge, but about fairness and restoration. If someone caused permanent damage to another person, restitution was required, and the principle of justice guided every decision. These rules applied to relationships, property, and even to accidents involving animals. God's laws emphasized responsibility, teaching that actions have consequences and fairness must prevail. The protection of property was also important. If someone's animal caused damage, the owner was responsible to make it right. If someone stole or lied about possessions, restitution was required. Every law pointed to God's concern for human life and well-being. It was clear that justice was essential and that his people were to care for one another with honesty and integrity. God's instructions extended to moral and social order. Lending to the poor was not optional, but a requirement. Treating strangers, widows, orphans, and the marginalized with compassion was demanded. Human life and dignity were central to these laws. God was teaching Israel that holiness was not only about worship, but also about living rightly, respecting others, and creating a society where fairness prevailed. As the laws continued, God instructed the people on honesty, integrity, and kindness. False testimony was forbidden. Theft and deception were prohibited. If someone's livestock or property was stolen or destroyed, they were to receive restitution. These laws built a community where people were protected and justice prevailed. God cared about the details of everyday life, and he wanted his people to understand that their actions reflected his character. God then moved to matters of social responsibility, emphasizing that his people should be fair, compassionate, and trustworthy. They were to respect others' property and lives, and to seek justice for those who could not defend themselves. Every law revealed God's concern for a society governed by his principles, not by chaos or self-interest. The instructions were practical, guiding the Israelites toward a life that honored both God and neighbor. God also instructed the people regarding their moral and spiritual conduct. Idolatry was forbidden. They were not to adopt the practices of surrounding nations. God wanted them to remain distinct, a holy people dedicated to him. Obedience to these laws was not optional. It was the foundation of the covenant. God made clear that their relationship with him involved both faithfulness and action. They were to follow his ways, uphold justice, and demonstrate compassion at every turn. The people were reminded that God was watching and that their behavior mattered. Treating others unfairly, oppressing the weak, or failing to uphold justice was a violation of his commandments. But obeying these laws was a reflection of God's character. By living according to his instructions, Israel demonstrated that they were a people set apart for God's purposes. Their lives were to be a testimony to his holiness, mercy, and justice. After these instructions, God called Moses to the mountain to receive further guidance. Moses communicated God's words to the people, and they responded with a unified voice, pledging to obey every command. This was the beginning of the covenant between God and Israel, a sacred agreement based on God's promises and the people's obedience. Blood was sprinkled on the altar and on the people, sealing the covenant in a solemn and binding act. It was a sign that God's relationship with his people was serious, sacred, and life-changing. Moses, along with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders, ascended the mountain. There they experienced the presence of God. They did not see him fully, for no human can see God's fullness and live, but they saw enough to recognize his holiness and majesty. They ate and drank in his presence, symbolizing fellowship and peace. God's people were invited into his presence, and this was a glimpse of the relationship he desired with them. Moses then went even higher into the cloud where God's glory rested. For 6 days, he waited, and on the 7th day, God spoke. Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. During this time, God revealed not just laws but the vision of a dwelling place, a sanctuary where he would live among his people. God did not give instructions for war or political power. He gave instructions for worship, for holiness, and for a sacred space where his presence could dwell with Israel. This dwelling, the tabernacle, would be a tangible reminder that God's presence was with them always. God instructed Moses on every detail of the sanctuary. The Ark of the Covenant would house the tablets of stone. The mercy seat on top of the ark would represent God's forgiveness. The golden lampstand would provide light, symbolizing his guidance. The table of showbread would represent provision. Every item, every measurement, every material had meaning. God was teaching Israel that he was involved in every detail of their lives, and that holiness required care, precision, and reverence. Aaron and his sons were appointed as priests to serve in the tabernacle. Their garments, made with beauty and glory, symbolized their role as intermediaries between God and the people. The priests would offer sacrifices, intercede for the people, and maintain holiness. God established a rhythm of worship through daily offerings, morning and evening, reminding the Israelites that devotion to him was to be constant and intentional. God also commanded the observance of the Sabbath, a day of rest. This was not simply a rule, but a reflection of trust. By ceasing labor, the people acknowledged that God was their provider and that reliance on him was foundational. The Sabbath was holy, a gift, and a sign of the covenant relationship between God and his people. During this time, God gave Moses the stone tablets, written by his own hand. They contained the commandments and laws that would guide Israel in righteousness. Everything seemed complete, yet while Moses remained on the mountain, the people below grew impatient. Fear and doubt began to replace faith, and they forgot the mighty acts God had performed to deliver them from Egypt. God began to give Moses precise instructions for building the tabernacle, the sacred place where his presence would dwell among his people. He spoke of the materials to be used: gold, silver, bronze, fine linens, acacia wood, and precious stones. Every element was chosen for a purpose, symbolizing the holiness and glory of God. The people were to give willingly from their wealth, hearts, and resources, offering what they had without compulsion. God values the heart behind giving more than the quantity of the gift. The Ark of the Covenant was to be made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold. It was to house the stone tablets of the law, representing God's covenant and his guidance for Israel. The mercy seat, placed on top of the ark, symbolized God's forgiveness. Between the mercy seat and the ark, God would meet with Moses and commune with his people. Every detail was a reminder that God desired to dwell in the midst of his people and that holiness required reverence and care. Next, God instructed Moses to make a table of pure gold to hold the showbread. This bread, replaced weekly, was a symbol of God's provision, reminding the Israelites that he would supply their every need. The golden lampstand, with its 7 lamps, was to illuminate the tabernacle, representing God's guidance and the light of his truth shining in a dark world. God wanted his people to understand that his presence was both practical and spiritual. He provides, guides, and illuminates. God also gave instructions for the altar of incense, which would be placed inside the tabernacle. Incense symbolized prayers rising to God, a fragrant offering pleasing in his sight. Worship was to be more than routine. It was to involve heart, intention, and devotion. God's people were learning that access to him required preparation, purity, and dedication. He then outlined the garments of the priests, starting with Aaron and his sons. Each piece had meaning: the tunic, the robe, the ephod, the breastplate, the sash, the turban, and the golden plate on the forehead. The colors, fabrics, and designs were all intentional, pointing to the holiness, beauty, and glory required to approach God. The breastplate contained 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, reminding the priests that they carried the people before God in their service. Every time a priest entered the holy place, he represented the nation before the living God, a constant reminder that their service was sacred and purposeful. God also described the consecration of the priests through oil and sacrifices. Their role was not honorary. It was a calling of responsibility, service, and intercession. They were to be holy, reflecting God's holiness to the people. God explained that their work was not only for the benefit of the priests themselves, but for the entire nation, as they stood between God and the people, offering forgiveness and guidance. He commanded daily and weekly offerings, establishing a rhythm of devotion that would shape the spiritual life of the nation. Morning and evening sacrifices reminded Israel that God's presence and provision were constant and that worship was to be integrated into daily life. These practices taught the Israelites discipline, faith, and the importance of consistency in their relationship with God. God then gave Moses instructions for the Sabbath, a day of rest and holy dedication. Rest was not only for physical renewal, it was a spiritual practice. It reminded the people to trust God for provision and to acknowledge His sovereignty. The Sabbath became a sign of the covenant between God and Israel, a weekly celebration of freedom, dependence, and devotion. Finally, God called Moses to take some of the anointing oil and apply it to the tabernacle and the priests. This oil symbolized holiness, setting them apart for God's purposes. Everything was consecrated and dedicated to Him. God was demonstrating that approaching Him required intentional preparation, purity, and reverence. Holiness was not an abstract concept. It was a lifestyle reflected in worship, service, and obedience. God gave Moses further instructions for the craftsmen, Bezalel and Oholiab, whom He filled with wisdom, understanding, and skill. They were tasked with leading the construction of the tabernacle and crafting the sacred objects. God's people were to contribute willingly, bringing their skills, resources, and hearts to the work. This act of communal devotion demonstrated unity, generosity, and reverence for God's presence. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the detailed instructions for the tabernacle, the people below grew restless. 40 days had passed, and they had not seen him return. Fear and impatience began to take hold. Their hearts, though freed from Egypt, still struggled with trust. They wanted something tangible, something they could see and control. In their impatience, they approached Aaron and demanded that he make them a god to lead them. Aaron, though a faithful servant of God, gave in to their pressure. He gathered the gold jewelry from the people and fashioned it into a golden calf. The people said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." They bowed down and worshipped it, offering sacrifices and celebrating with revelry. In one moment, they forgot the mighty works God had performed to deliver them. They abandoned the covenant and replaced the living God with a lifeless image made by human hands. God saw what had happened. His anger burned against the people, for they had corrupted themselves. He told Moses that he would destroy them and start over, creating a nation from Moses himself. But Moses interceded. He pleaded with God to spare the people, reminding him of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses argued that the Egyptians would say God brought his people out only to kill them in the wilderness. He appealed to God's mercy, patience, and faithfulness. God listened. He relented, showing that while sin is serious and consequences follow, His mercy is greater. Moses descended the mountain carrying the stone tablets, unaware of what he would see. When he saw the people worshiping the golden calf, his anger burned. In a dramatic act, he threw the tablets to the ground, shattering them. The covenant appeared broken, but the story did not end in destruction. God's justice was real, but His mercy was also present. Moses confronted Aaron, who tried to justify his actions. The people who had led the rebellion were held accountable. 3,000 men fell that day, showing that sin carries consequences. Yet God's forgiveness remained available. Moses returned to God to plead once more, asking Him to forgive the people and even offering his own life in their place. God answered Moses, showing both justice and mercy. Those guilty faced consequences, but the nation as a whole was not abandoned. God's covenant remained, reaffirming that He is faithful even when His people falter. Moses then asked to see God's glory. God agreed, but allowed Moses to see only a part, from a cleft in a rock. God passed by, proclaiming His name and revealing His character. The Lord, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. This declaration showed that God's power is matched by his mercy. Holiness does not preclude compassion. Justice is not devoid of love. Moses understood that God's presence was both awe-inspiring and merciful, a combination that demands reverence, trust, and obedience. God instructed Moses to carve new tablets to replace the broken ones, renewing the covenant. The people were reminded that sin has consequences, but God's promises remain. Moses' face shone after his encounter with God, so bright that he had to wear a veil when speaking to the people. This visible sign demonstrated the profound impact of being in God's presence. His glory left an imprint on Moses, reminding the people that God is real, holy, and transformative. The Israelites began constructing the tabernacle exactly as God had commanded. They gave willingly, bringing gold, silver, bronze, fine linens, and acacia wood. Skilled craftsmen, Bezalel and Oholiab, led the work under God's guidance. Every curtain, every thread, every piece of gold was carefully prepared. The Ark of the Covenant was constructed and overlaid with gold. The mercy seat was placed on top, symbolizing God's forgiveness. The table for the showbread, the golden lampstand, and the altar of incense were all built with precision, each item filled with symbolism that pointed to God's presence, provision, and guidance. The priest's garments were made exactly according to God's instructions. Aaron and his sons were consecrated through anointing with oil, setting them apart for holy service. Their garments were beautiful and symbolic, reminding both the priests and the people that approaching God requires reverence, holiness, and dedication. The breastplate with 12 stones represented the 12 tribes, showing that the priests carried the people before God continually. God's instructions for worship, sacrifice, and priestly service demonstrated that obedience, reverence, and devotion are not optional. They are central to a covenant relationship with Him. When all was completed, the tabernacle was assembled. The curtains were hung, the ark was placed in the Holy of Holies, and the altar and lampstand were arranged exactly as God had commanded. The priests were consecrated, and the people stepped back to witness the fulfillment of God's instructions. Then, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. A cloud covered the tent of meeting, a visible sign that God's presence was dwelling among His people. Moses could not enter, for the glory of God was overwhelming. Yet this presence was a confirmation that God had not abandoned His people. He was with them, guiding, protecting, and sanctifying them. The book of Exodus concludes with this powerful image, God's presence leading the Israelites. When the cloud lifted, they moved. When it remained, they stayed. God's glory filled the tabernacle, a constant reminder that He is not distant but intimately involved in the lives of His people. Exodus 21-40 shows that salvation is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning. God delivers, teaches, and dwells with His people. Freedom without God's instruction can lead to chaos, but with His guidance, His people can live in justice, holiness, and fellowship with Him. The laws, the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the covenant teach timeless truths. Obedience is vital, but God's mercy allows for restoration. Worship is more than ritual. It is heart, intention, and devotion. Holiness is not abstract. It is lived through relationships, justice, and reverence for God's presence. The presence of God is the ultimate goal, not simply rules or rituals, but relationship, guidance, and transformation. Exodus 21-40 challenges readers to consider their own lives. How do we treat others? Do we value justice and mercy? Are we willing to worship God in spirit and truth, not just in form? Do we recognize the holiness of God and live accordingly? God's instructions to Israel were detailed, precise, and full of meaning, showing that He cares about every aspect of life, from the personal to the communal, from worship to justice. The story of the golden calf reminds us that impatience, doubt, and disobedience have consequences. Yet Moses' intercession and God's mercy show that restoration is possible. The construction of the tabernacle demonstrates the importance of obedience, skill, generosity, and dedication. Every element points to a God who is powerful, holy, merciful, and relational. He desires to dwell among His people, and to shape them into a nation that reflects his character to the world. Exodus 21-40 is not merely historical narrative. It is a blueprint for life with God. It teaches that freedom requires guidance, obedience requires heart, and holiness requires God's presence. God's glory is not distant. It transforms, teaches, and guides. For Israel, and for all who follow him, the journey of faith is ongoing. God delivers, instructs, restores, and dwells with his people. The story concludes with the assurance that God remains present, guiding his people through life, worship, and obedience. God's presence is not distant. He guides, restores, and dwells with his people. Exodus reminds us that freedom, obedience, and worship go hand in hand. If you want more Bible stories explained simply and clearly, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the life-changing truths of God's Word.